Good afternoon and welcome to a very special event here. I'm Kathleen Hayes in New York City on behalf of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and welcoming you to the annual economic outlook. This year, of course, focused on the economy in the U.S. and actually around the world in what has been the year of the pandemic, a year like has not been seen in so many years. My background is covering the Federal Reserve since basically the mid-'80s, the days of Paul Volcker breaking the back of inflation through the crazy stock market NASDAQ bubble of the 90s, which of course reminds us of a bit of some things that are happening now today. The great financial crisis, the Great Recession, the recovery, and now all the things that we have gone through. Before we get started, I want to be careful to note the Council is an independent and nonpartisan organization, takes no institutional policy positions. Any views expressed here today are my own and, of course, Robert Kaplan's. And we want to really encourage you to get involved, get engaged. You can start sending in your questions. To do so, I'm going to ask Rob Kaplan a few of my own to get started, and I'm going to keep an eye on yours as they come in to weave them into the conversation as well. So if you have a question, simply enter C as in cat, C as in cat, G as in George, A as in Apple, .live, ccga.live. I don't know if you've ever used it, but it's really simple, straightforward. Put your name in when you log on, you'll be introed. You can just get going and submitting your questions. So now let me formally introduce Robert Kaplan. He's president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, a job he took over in September of 2015. Prior to that, he worked on Wall Street. He rose to be vice chair of Goldman Sachs. He left to go to the Harvard Business School, where he taught young students all kinds of things about the world of business and more. And of course, now he is helping the Federal Reserve, the country, the world, figure out the lessons of this pandemic, what they mean, and where we're heading next. So, Rob, welcome to you. It's great to get together again.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Well, you know, Rob, I was thinking back, and I wanted to remind you and me and Victoria and tell our audience, if they weren't in Chicago, 11 months ago, that's where we were. This wasn't a virtual event. We were all assembled to get your thoughts, get your ideas. It was just 2 days after the Fed's emergency rate cut that kicked off this Herculean rapid effort by the Fed to see what they could do to prevent a health crisis from becoming a financial crisis. Stock market plunging, bond yields all over the place, the virus spreading, Seattle, New York epicenter, it goes on and on. When you look back, you had gotten on board after thinking about it for a while about this emergency rate cut. I'm wondering now, after 11 months, almost a year, how do you assess all the decisions you made? How do you assess the Fed's performance in this crucial time?
The good news about what we did is we acted quickly and boldly in size. And what was critical is we did have, many of us, and we did have active conversations with elected officials on both sides of the aisle, and we're encouraging of them to take action on fiscal policy, which they did, again, in a very bold way. And so I think we were well served by doing things that were unusual, bold, significant, and decisive to stabilize the financial markets and ensure that we had good access to capital for a bit, not perfect, by big and small companies. And also the fiscal relief ensured that those that were most directly affected had relief to be able to keep making ends meet. And I think that made a huge difference.
Yeah, and what a difference 11 months make, because even though we did get, a lot of Fed officials then were hoping we wouldn't get the big, deep recession. We did have that month when the U.S. economy dropped by more than 30%, if I'm remembering correctly. But it was big, we know that. So now you've got a pretty decent forecast, 5% growth, maybe even better this year. Looking back at 2020, it was just down 2.5%. Does today's ISM Manufacturing report, purchasing managers U.S. number, staying at a very high level, does it increase your confidence in this fairly positive outlook for GDP you have?
So I'd say it's consistent with my outlook, but I'm conscious there are a couple of significant downsides, and then there are meaningful upsides. On the downside, while we're going to go through a very difficult period in January and in February with the resurgence of this virus, the bigger downside I'm concerned about is do the variants and new variants of the virus, do they prove to be more persistent, less receptive to the vaccine? I know most epidemiologists and scientists think the vaccines will be effective against those, but the jury's out on that. And how quickly can we get the population vaccinated? And so for that forecast of 5% growth for this year to come to the fore, we need those downsides not to materialize. We need positive developments regarding to the vaccine, rollout of the vaccine, and its effectiveness against the variants. On the positive side, we've got substantial fiscal stimulus. My forecast doesn't take into account additional stimulus. And we do know that mobility and engagement, we believe, is going to improve as we go through the year if we're able to combat the virus and these vaccines get rolled out. So the ISM manufacturing is just sort of a piece of the puzzle that I think is consistent with the potential of the U.S. economy.
Well, since you touched on fiscal stimulus and added that this forecast does not depend on additional stimulus.
That's right.
A calculation I saw recently, if you add up all the stimulus from March to March, last year to this year, it's going to be about $5 trillion. Is it your view then that the recovery is going to happen regardless, and implicit in this stimulus, if you're just worried about growing the GDP, getting employment down, et cetera, is not necessary now, additionally on top of the $5 trillion?
So no, it's not going to happen regardless. There are a couple of areas that I'm particularly sensitive to and our forecast is sensitive to. Number one, continued relief for those who are unemployed or who can't get enough hours and can't make ends meet. That needs to continue. And then the second part is part of the fiscal package is vaccinations and money for making sure we've got a robust vaccination program and getting schools reopened. Those parts in particular, I think it's fair to say, while my forecast doesn't call for more fiscal policy, I think it assumes that we've got enough funding to get those things done. And this new proposal is a part of that.
Well, Rob, I love this. We've already got a question from the audience, which is right here on my list as well. What indicators are you looking at that signal it's time for an exit from this? Actually, let me rephrase that. What Rich is saying is, what indicators are you looking at that signal we're getting out of this pandemic economy? When are you going to say, aha, we're there?
The things I'm particularly looking for to see if we're weathering the pandemic are, number one, continued pace of vaccinations. Number two, tracking how this variant affects cases and hospitalizations. But I particularly watch every day the trend of hospitalizations. And so if the trend of hospitalizations as we vaccinate through the spring and as the variant unfolds, if the pace of hospitalizations dramatically declines, that'll be something I'll be watching very, very carefully. And then beyond that, I'm going to want to look to see that those who've lost their jobs, often in a person-to-person contact industry, that mobility and engagement, which we track, as you know, we have our own tracking metric at the Dallas Fed, that mobility engagement will improve enough that a lot of those businesses will reopen and those people can get back their jobs or find new jobs. So that's a second thing. So vaccinations, the virus, mobility, which in turn will lead to improvement in hospitalizations and businesses being more comfortable reopening, and consumer being willing to more broadly engage in a range of activities.
Okay, so now this will lead to my follow on Rich's question, which is, let's assume the best. lots of vaccines stumble at the beginning, but it gets streamlined. They start, coming out more quickly. And so the virus tails off. We've already seen cases dropping in many places. What are you watching for to know that it's time to start normalizing policy? What kind of things are you going to be looking at to make that decision?
So as it relates to asset purchases, we have an outcome-based test, which is substantial further improvement. And so I'm going to want to see real evidence that we are weathering this pandemic and have weathered this pandemic and are putting it in the rearview mirror. I'm going to be deliberately vague as to what those exact metrics will be, because I think at this point that's appropriate. I don't know what the timing of that will be, but I'll be carefully watching to see if we reach those outcomes. That's what I'll be looking for.
Well, following on that, Jay Powell said on Wednesday, Fed chair, at the end of the FOMC meeting, it's premature to even talk about tapering bond purchases. Your forecast is sufficiently strong, though. I just have to ask you, whatever you were thinking about might be the time to taper. When you see growth coming that's strong, even without additional stimulus, and if we are heading down that road, does that maybe change in your mind the sense of when it might be time to taper?
The reason it doesn't at this point, and I wouldn't talk about timing, is we're still in the teeth of things. So the forecast is just that. It's a forecast. And the only thing I've learned, if I've learned nothing in this job, the main thing I've learned, whatever our forecast is, it's going to change. We're still in the teeth of this pandemic. We have a number of uncertainties. And I think the wisest thing is to let now the economy unfold and to be patient and not prejudge it.
Okay. In this scenario of getting to 5% growth or better this year, unemployment, how much progress do you see being made there?
What's consistent with that forecast is getting down to an unemployment rate that's in the neighborhood of 4.5% by the end of the year.
Okay. And how far does that get the Fed toward thinking we're getting closer to the point where, hey, why not normalize?
So again, I'm gonna deliberately and consciously avoid speculating on what point that will be. I'm going to leave. That's going to be a judgment we're going to make, and we'll make together. The only thing we've said to people is, if as we're getting to that judgment, we will be clear in our communication. We'll give the economy and the people in the economy advance notice of where we're heading. But I'm going to be very deliberate today in not trying to prejudge it. And part of the reason is we're in the teeth of the pandemic right now, and we've still got a lot of uncertainty. That may change in the months ahead. But the jury's out, and we'll have to see.
Okay. I want to get back to the ISM report to ask you a bigger question, and that's about inflation, because you have said repeatedly, look, we're going to have some sort of temporary push up in inflation,
right,
partly because of comparing it to last year-over-year numbers, but the structural forces are so strong with globalization and technology. Don't worry about it. It's not going to be, it's going to be, the wish is actually to even start worrying about it. But when you look inside the ISM report today, what struck me is the backlogs are lengthening. The supplier deliveries are at a 9-month high. People are talking about these domestic supply side constraints, supply chain, like people can't get to work, and you want lumber to fix your house, and you can't get it. Price is paid at 82.1. Does this report give you some pause, make you wonder, got to really watch that closely, see if there's something going on here with inflation potentially?
Well, I'll speak for me. There's nothing new in the report that I'm not hearing from contacts. As we have broad conversations, we're hearing about semiconductor shortages, metal shortages, wood products, packaging products, and other supply outages. The issue is, and I'm expecting you'll see some of that if we're able to reopen the economy and consumers more actively engaged in a broad range of activity. We're going to see some of those pressures. My own judgment is most of them, in the contacts I talk to, tell me these are not things they expect to continue in the medium term. They're shorter term supply issues that, as we reopen, will tend to get worked through. So I'm looking for trends in inflation that are more persistent as opposed to those things that are transitory. And we'll have to just judge and make judgments on which is which.
So Robert, another interesting question from one of our audience members today, asking if you could comment on the role of BlackRock on helping the Federal Reserve run a bond buying program during the pandemic, and more broadly about how the Fed has intervened in the corporate bond market. Is this the new normal? And I think it ties into this bigger question of all kinds of things the Fed's looking at. Are they a new part of the Fed's toolkit? But let's start with that particular one, with bond buying and the corporate bond market, which you follow so closely.
So we did something extraordinary back in March and April, in that we created these 13 so-called 13-3 programs, municipal bond market, corporate bond market, various other markets, asset-backed securities markets. I would view those programs as extraordinary, and are programs that it's very appropriate will lapse. Some of them have already lapsed at 12/31. Others will continue to lapse, and I think it's healthy for them to lapse. So to your questioner, down the road in the years ahead, on the one hand, this is something on the shelf that we'll have the ability to do in the years ahead. I think it's the kind of thing you're only going to want to do in extraordinary circumstances, and not a mainstream a part of what we might do in the future. It would take extraordinary circumstances, in my view, to use some of these programs again.
Well, and so more broadly, building on this question, lots of different initiatives we would never have heard the Fed looking at a year ago, 5 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. The issue of inequality, the green initiative.
Right.
That's a much broader definition, it seems, of monetary policy, of Fed policy. So should we view this as a response to the pandemic, part of what needs to be done now, or are these permanent changes?
So I've been in the job now 5 years, and so there's people who've been around the Fed longer than I have. But we do, as you know, we do probably more work than any other reserve bank on the energy business. And we made a decision long time ago, and I've written several things, and we've written several things on this. In order to understand the energy business, you've got to understand alternatives. You've got to understand the national climate estimate. You have to understand risk of rising water temperatures, rising water levels, more hurricanes, storms, floods, fires. And so that has been a mainstream part of our analysis. We don't make a judgment one way or the other, but we do make a judgment that the world is going to need an ample supply of energy. Fossil fuels will be part of it, but growth in wind, solar, and other renewables and alternatives will be part of it. And also we've had to understand climate change because it has a direct effect on our district and on the country. Hurricane Harvey is an example. Price tag on Hurricane Harvey is about $80 billion. So these are significant events, and to do our job, we've got to understand them. On the issue of equality, it's been my view, as you're measuring, and this has been true for years now, as you're measuring full employment, if you have specific groups like we do today, but we've had in the past, that are underrepresented, we found that by running the economy hotter leading up to the pandemic, we were able to get some of these groups into the workforce. And I think that's part of, for me, judging how much labor slack there is and whether we're meeting our full employment objectives. So I don't think these are things that have just happened recently. We've been working on these for years. And I personally think we should continue to incorporate these aspects in our economic work and our judgments about the economy.
Speaking of energy, there's a question from obviously one of your fans, because Thomas says that he notes that on Friday, you mentioned that it's going to be critical for the U.S. to have a healthy oil and gas business. So could you comment on the transition over the next 10 years and how it's going to impact a healthier GDP potentially?
Yes, so we are going to see, quote unquote, peak oil demand globally in the probably not too distant future. I don't know exactly when it will be. It will probably be in the not too distant future, which means while energy demand is going to go up meaningfully around the world, we're going to produce a lot more wind, solar, renewables. There's going to be battery storage technology. And I think all those developments are welcome, and there'll be plenty of capital to go into those. The challenge will be, as we continue to grow in those areas, you're still going to have substantial demand for fossil fuels. And so the context I said that, you're going to need a viable and healthy oil and gas business to continue to meet those needs as we increasingly transition away from oil and gas to other forms of energy. But it's not going to be something that happens in the next year or two. This is a multi-decade transition. And so we've got to keep that in mind as we go through it.
What's the impact on other countries? This is from Professor Sean, especially developing nations, of not being vaccinated. It was estimated by the World Economic Forum that the rest of the world may not be vaccinated fully until 2024. What's the impact on the U.S.?
Slower growth globally means, on the margin, slower growth in the United States. And so we make up less than 5% of the world's population. I think something like 40 or 50% of S&P 500 revenues come from outside the U.S. If the globe grows more slowly, that will spill to some extent. That will affect growth in the United States. So the extent the world is healthier, gets vaccinated, and weathers this virus, it'll be better for the U.S., in my opinion.
I want to combine two questions here. One, how will the aftermath of the pandemic differ or look the same as the aftermath of the Great Recession? And maybe a little more specifically, if we're talking about employment, and of course the Fed has made part of its metric for when to normalize and all that, one of them is maximum employment, full employment, whatever you want to call it. There'll be many jobs that won't be coming back. How is the Fed looking at full employment, which may have different contours post-pandemic?
All right. So I think the aftermath of the Great Recession is going to be very different than the aftermath of this pandemic. And why is that? I'll give you some examples why. The Great Recession, by and large, affected businesses across the board. It was a financial crisis. We had real challenges in availability of credit and financial conditions for some time. And it affected workers across the board. This pandemic, on the other hand, is affected specifically person-to-person contact industries most negatively. Household income did not drop in this pandemic. It stayed solid, mainly due to fiscal support, and consumers kept spending, unlike the Great Recession, but they shifted their spending to other areas. And the financial sector, by and large, especially the banks, have been very resilient this time, not a source of instability. So because of all that, and we also had much more aggressive fiscal and monetary policy response. So I think we have the opportunity to recover much more rapidly from this downturn than we did from the Great Recession, where, remember, the recovery from the Great Recession was much more halting and slower. And 3 or 4 years in, by 2013, we still had a 7% unemployment rate. I think we have a real chance here to get back more quickly to what we might consider full employment in a shorter amount of time, because the nature of the shock and the nature of the reaction to it. And so to your question on full employment, I still believe we can get to levels of unemployment that we were at previously. I think it's going to be critical, though, to get there, to get women with children back into the workforce. They've left disproportionately in this downturn versus the Great Recession. And I think it's going to be even more critical to do beef up retraining, skills training, to help people who've lost their jobs, particularly low-income workers, get redeployed back into the economy. But I think we can do those things, and I think we can get back to full employment in the next period of time.
Rob, another question from Gary Jones. Do you believe that reshoring manufacturing will have any appreciable impact on the economy, and is that included in your forecast?
There will be certain items as a result of this experience where we say, boy, we really ought to have domestic capability. PPE, we ought to have domestic capability to produce our own PPE. That'll happen in a number of sectors. I don't know whether that's going to go beyond strategic sectors. I think still a great opportunity, and my guess is growth in the U.S. is still going to be based heavily on logistics, supply chain arrangements with Mexico, Canada, and including working where appropriate with China while we're competing with them. And I still think trade and globalization will be a part of the U.S. growing. But for certain strategic areas after this experience, I think we'll feel like it would be wiser to have more domestic capability. I don't know that'll be enough to move the needle on the whole economy.
I have to ask you about GameStop, Reddit, hedge funds, shorting, and you're a Fed official now. If you were still the vice chair of Goldman, I might ask a somewhat different question. However, you can answer this any way you like. Because for the Federal Reserve, it seems to me you're not the SEC, but certainly when it comes to financial stability, that is right up there with maximum employment and inflation being steady. So with looking at it that way, is there anything you see here that, especially after years at the Harvard Business School and working at Goldman Sachs at the top level, that concerns you, that it could be something that could be destabilizing?
So you hit on it. The thing I'm always watching for is financial instability, and particularly looking at positioning today in particular of non-bank financial institutions. I think the banks, we have pretty good visibility on capital and stress testing. Non-bank financials, I'm watching very carefully potential instability, funding risks that might occur. And I'm conscious of the fact that we've had to make these extraordinary moves that we've had at the Fed with interest rates and bond buying. It does have some effect on flow of funds, liquidity in the system, and financial assets. So I guess I'll put it this way. I'm monitoring it very, very carefully. I don't know that I see something here that presents a systemic risk at this point, but I think it's worth monitoring very carefully and being conscious of the fact that when you have, again, these extraordinary measures we're taking on monetary policy, it's worth monitoring very carefully the non-bank financial system. Well,
since you mentioned, the additional liquidity, extraordinary stimulus, as some have called it, you've got the key rate at 0. So it's like, hey, borrow some money. It's almost free, right? If you can get it. The Fed's doing what many people call financial repression with the bond purchases, putting a cap on yields. So, you can't get yield, certainly not in government bonds, some in more risky bonds, but it seems like but the obvious thing is that people would say, well, it's kind of forcing investors to say, guess I just better keep buying stocks. And I think this gets to that question of things that look kind of like a bubble. And again, I sympathize, I'm sure many do, with your position. You got to treat the patient with the medicine you have now. But what if the patient ends up with another illness or malady because of the treatment? I think that this question of how long you keep this treatment going is so critical.
So I've said pretty consistently, and I'll say again today, while we're in the teeth of the pandemic, and until it's clear that we've weathered the pandemic, I'm supportive and believe the Fed should be using its tools aggressively. Once it's clear that we've weathered this pandemic and we're on the path to putting this pandemic in the rearview mirror, I think it would be much healthier for the U.S. economy for us to be weaning the economy and the markets off some of these extraordinary measures.
You said also, I believe on Friday, that you thought you're looking forward to this lively debate at the Fed over when to taper, how to taper, et cetera, which seems to imply that there's different views here, different sides about when to move, how to move, and that can you shed any light on that? I know you speak for yourself, you don't speak for the members, but it's certainly a big deal to people outside the Fed, investors, et cetera.
Here, I put it this way. I think one of the great things about the Fed, and again, I'm not a career Fed person, I came from the outside. I'm a business person, I taught leadership. One of the things I've been impressed with at the Fed is robust debate, disagreement, and a very healthy process I think that serves us very, very well. So I think I'm not going to get into exactly how this will unfold because I don't know, or the timing, but yeah, people can be assured that if it's an issue they're worried about or wondering about, we have a very high quality group. We do tremendous detail work. We're active talking to contacts, and we're aware of these issues, and we will have an explicit discussion that I think will be very healthy. I just don't know when it will be appropriate to have that, but we'll be doing it privately first and then telegraphing it. But I think people should have confidence in our process.
One more quick follow so I can move on to some other of these excellent audience questions that are coming in. Is there a specific, say, theoretical issue or technical issue that people don't agree on? Is there some key question that has to be answered besides, well, we can't talk about it yet, it just doesn't seem right? Maybe there isn't. I'm just curious if there's one thing you could single out.
Let me answer it this way. There's a number of ways that I work on that informs my judgments. There's economic data, usually backward looking, sometimes in this crisis, a little stale. There's all the 5 frequency data. There's all the models we run. And then most importantly for me during this crisis, discussions with contacts, which I do, as you know, extensively. When you wrap all that together, there are trade-off decisions and tensions, or things that the model might suggest will work one way, but you're hearing from business they'll work another way. And so each Fed president and people around the FOMC table does this kind of analysis, and I know I do. And so I think if you didn't have debate and disagreement on some of these issues, it would concern me. Yeah, of course you do. This is not a science. There's some art to this, and judgment is a key part of our job.
So another question well, it's from Charles Burhan, and he's asking quite simply, how can the Federal Reserve play a role in restructuring student debt? As someone who's been a teacher, as someone who's looking at the weak points in the economy, the things that hold it back, can the Fed play a role? Does it? Will it?
On the student debt front, other than doing research on the topic, I think that's part of the fiscal decision-making power of the government. As you know, what I do feel is right in our wheelhouse is looking at the entire educational ecosystem, starting with early childhood literacy, availability daycare, half-day versus full-day pre-K, secondary education, skills training, and then college. My own view is, and I've said this about I'll just say to your questioner, my thought is on student debt. It's partly about debt, but it's a symptom. And that all the work I've done suggests that if you go to college and you finish within 5 or 6 years and get the diploma, while you have student debt, all the studies I show suggest it's reasonably manageable. If, on the other hand, you go for 5 or 6 years or longer and you never do graduate, which is an uncomfortably high percentage of people going, student debt's a real problem. To me, it suggests there's something wrong with what we're doing in improving, again, early childhood literacy, secondary education, skills, reading levels, and a lot of kids going to college might be better served going to skills training first, then to college, or we need to improve our readiness. And I think it's more about that issue for me, for much of this, than it is the debt.
Okay, here's a question, again, that isn't your purview specifically. However, government spending, the budgets that are being debated, what additional stimulus we're going to get certainly affects the economy, so therefore affects the Fed. In this push for more spending, maybe even as much as $2 trillion more, do you see a risk of inflation? Are you concerned about the debt deficit that's getting ever bigger, and with that in particular, that part of it? Do you see financial instability implications?
So I'll say 2 or 3 things. First, I'm most sensitive in the work we're doing here about workers that have lost their jobs or can't make ends meet getting the relief they need. Second, being able to fund sufficiently vaccine programs and other programs and getting schools reopened. And other than that, I'll stay out of the government debate, other than to say your issue that you mentioned about government debt. I said pre-pandemic that the growth in US government debt was likely unsustainable. And the only reason we're able to sustain it is the dollar is the world's reserve currency. I am very cognizant of whatever we do, we're going to need to find ways to moderate our debt growth in the years ahead. So that's always a factor in the back of my mind.
And a question we'll have plenty of time to look at because it's going to be with us for a while. Another question, another question, and you've sort of touched on it, I think, but maybe not. In terms of states and cities, local governments needing assistance, is that something the Fed looks at? Is it something that you can have a direct link to what's going on in the economy?
I'm talking to mayors, often local judges that make these decisions, school superintendents, you name it. We're talking to city and state officials regularly. And what they're telling me is because of the fiscal hole that occurred earlier in the year, they're struggling to make ends meet themselves as they are trying to fund vaccination programs, police force, getting schools reopened. They're under strain. That's what they're telling me.
And that question came in from Christina Collins. I like to put a name with these as I can. Here, since you just mentioned the dollar, Avery Eister has a question here. The US dollar has lost a decent amount of value in a relatively short period of time. Other currencies like the British pound, the Aussie dollar, et cetera, aren't losing value at the same rate. Are you worried about the long-term value of the US dollar, how it will impact international trade? And I would probably add, are you in that camp that thinks the dollar's role as the reserve currency is in threat?
I'm always conscious of what the dollar is doing. I've learned the hard way for 30 years in the markets. It's very hard to predict what the currency is going to do. It usually has to do with relative strength of our economy versus others in the world. And on the dollar being the world's reserve currency, I've said many times, it is currently the world's reserve currency. I think it will stay that way, at least for the foreseeable future. But I think we make a mistake to conduct our fiscal affairs and our economic affairs, assuming that it will go on forever. There may be changes that we can't foresee globally with technology and so on. And I think the reason we're able to run these large deficits and this amount of debt is because we're the world's reserve currency. I think we'd be well served not to rely on that too heavily.
And I want to throw in one on China, because their economy will have been, the only one that posted, it was tiny growth in 2020. It's recovering. Many people attribute it to a rapid response to the virus. They too, though, are having some resurgence now. So I guess nobody got it 100% right here. But how does their economy look to you? And how do you view this, this time now when the US and China may be addressing some of their economic issues like trade?
So it's right to say that in 2020, their performance was better because they were able to contain the virus and recover faster. Having said that, they've got some real challenges in China. You've heard me talk about before. They got a very high level of debt to GDP, and they historically have used increasing debt to GDP to stimulate GDP, and they've got an aging population that they've got to deal with, and they have a severe climate issue, which if you've ever been to Beijing or Shanghai, I don't need to explain that to you, and they're going to have to spend trillions on that. We're going to be competing with China for the rest of our lives. There'll be areas that we should be cooperating, there'll be areas where we need to compete, and there'll be tensions about intellectual property, technology transfer, and a level playing field. But China's got a pretty long list of challenges that they're going to have to come to grips with. And I think, but the United States is going to be competing with them, and they're going to be a formidable competitor.
So what would you say, I just want to pursue this a little bit further. What would you say is the #1 challenge with China? we're butting heads over big tech, although we kind of agree with them on some of those points. We have trade, we have, where did you
issue for us, number one issue for the United States with them, number one issue is technology transfer and intellectual property rights. And then to some extent on certain items, level playing field. And we're competing with them increasingly around the world. I think it's in our interest to find ways to work with them when we can, but it's not surprising we've had these disputes on intellectual property rights and technology transfer.
A couple more questions before we run out of time here. Just came in another one from Ilya Volkovsky. Do you expect the low interest rate environment to continue, in particular in view of restructuring regarding China's role?
So for globally, well, rates, in my view, have been low for a number of reasons, but the predominant one in developed countries is expectations for future growth are sluggish. Now, we're going to have a big rebound this year, I hope, and into 2022, but as you get over the horizon, slowing workforce growth due to aging and productivity that hasn't grown enough to offset that, that is the number one driver still of global interest rates. And it's, for me, it's the number one reason why global interest rates have been surprisingly sluggish over the last number of years. And it's going to continue into the future.
Okay, from Rich, how do we ensure an equitable recovery for all Americans? Lots of women, particularly Black and Latino women, were affected the most, as seen in the most recent jobs report.
Listen, so this is where we've got to find, we've talked a lot about the Black unemployment rate, the Hispanic unemployment is much higher than the overall unemployment rate. And again, women with children, particularly low-income women with children, have disproportionately left the workforce. So we're going to have to find ways to beef up skill training, beef up availability of daycare, in my opinion, early childhood daycare, particularly to help women re-enter, and to help Blacks and Hispanics either re-enter the workforce in their old job or get retrained so they can get a new job. And this is particularly true for those with a high school education or less. These are structural changes. These are not monetary policy changes, but we spent a lot of time on this at the Dallas Fed. Availability of Wi-Fi will be one other initiative that I think will help bring those groups back in. And we can run the economy hotter, is the last comment, as we get over the horizon.
And that's one of the first things that started surfacing from the researchers, economists saying, hey, the Fed has to do more to reduce the Black unemployment rate. Should the Fed target the Black unemployment rate in its mandate?
I'll leave that to Congress, who makes those rules. I would just say I'm already, and we are already looking at that in every unemployment report. It's not new. We've been doing it for the last few years.
Here's a question from NE. Maybe that's for the Nor'easter we're having here in the Northeast right now. Could you give any examples of regional differences in needed economic responses and how that's deliberated on at the Fed?
Yeah, the regions in the United States are very different. Texas, for example, has a different economic composition, but migration patterns are probably the most notable. Texas is experiencing a strong migration in of people and firms from around the country that are coming from other states. We have a different tax regime. We have different, strengths and strengths and weaknesses. And I think that, as well as the education system, we are different across the country. We have to improve our education system in Texas, for example, disproportionately. And yeah, that all gets factored in and brought forward in our Federal Open Market Committee meetings.
All right, Rob, was there any closing thought you want to leave here? We've had a wonderful conversation today.
Yeah. No, thank you, and great to talk with you, Kathleen, as always. And listen, we're still in the teeth of this pandemic, and we're not out of the woods yet, and we need to be aggressive in our fiscal and monetary policy actions. And I'm hopeful that by doing that, we'll ultimately get beyond this pandemic and can then get to a more normalized environment in the months and years ahead.
Well, with you on our team, Rob, we have great confidence. So thank you so
All right,
much thank you for joining us. And I'm sure the audience is thrilled to have heard all this from you today. I want to thank you guys out there for sending all those great questions in. Boy, oh boy, you really made my job easier, although it's always easy to think of questions for Rob Kaplan. And a very important reminder, a recording of this conversation is going to be available for playback on the the Chicago Council on Global Affairs social channels on the website shortly. I don't know about you, but I love to go back and listen again to what Rob says. So thank you all again.
Thank you. Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks, everybody.